Alright, hi everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. So this is the first video for Module 4. So this is lecture video 13 if you're keeping count. So in Module 4, we're going to deal heavily with behavior modification. One thing to note is that some of the information we're going to be discussing did come with your textbook. Some of the information, especially in the next couple of lecture videos, is going to be additional information beyond what's in your textbook. My purpose here is to make sure that you're prepared to handle problem behaviors in a classroom setting or really in any environment. If you're going to interact with people, if you're going to have a spouse, if you're going to have kids, then you need to know how to use the tools of behavior modification. So in this video, we're going to talk about the basics behind behavior modification, sort of a crash course, and then we'll get into some more application of that going forward. We will talk about activity 10 in this lecture video. If you have any questions, please let me know. We're going to go ahead and get started. Alright, so as I said, today's lecture is going to be a crash course in the basics of behavior modification. And behavior modification could also be referred to as learning. So learning is a relatively permanent influence on behavior, knowledge, and thinking skills, which comes about through experience. So one thing to note here, when we're talking about learning and behavior modification, we're talking about nurture rather than nature. We're talking about something in your environment that changes the way you behave or the way you think. Now it asks how we can know that learning has taken place, and in the third section of the class we talked about how to assess for learning things like knowledge and thinking skills. So this section of the class is more focused on behavior. How can we know that learning has taken place? Well, we'll see new behaviors. We'll see changes in behaviors. Now, one thing I do want to note from the very beginning is that behavior modification is a process. It's usually something that takes time, and something that's really important here is consistency. So you want to, specifically when we're talking later about punishment and reinforcement, I'll touch on this again, but you want to reinforce or punish behaviors immediately and consistently according to your plan. So this is not something that happens overnight. Typically this is something that takes time and consistent effort, but after time and consistent effort has happened, we will see a change in behavior if learning has taken place. So when we're talking about something like behavior modification or behavioral therapies, we're going to measure our success based on specific measurable behaviors. So for example, if you're doing a behavioral therapy with a student that has aggression, then we're going to measure before we start the therapy how many times a day or an hour or a week or whatever is appropriate, how many times does this student have acts of aggression, and then after we start implementing our treatment, do we see a change in that number? So we're going to use behavior that is measurable as our measure of whether or not we've been successful. So we're going to be talking about two major approaches to learning today. We're going to be talking about classical conditioning first, and then we will also be talking about operant conditioning, and then the next couple of lectures coming up will speak more specifically to some applications, especially of operant conditioning. But first of all, classical conditioning. If you are familiar with classical conditioning, then Pavlov is probably the example that comes to mind. But don't worry, if you're not familiar with classical conditioning, you will be in just a second, and you'll understand what Pavlov had going on in his experiments. So basically here, classical conditioning is a type of learning in which an organism, which if we're talking about a classroom setting would probably be your students, they learn to connect or associate stimuli. Two things that are happening during a very similar time span. A neutral stimulus becomes associated with a meaningful stimulus and acquires the capacity to elicit a similar response. The big picture idea behind classical conditioning is that there are certain things that cause a response naturally. So, for example, if there was a very loud clap of thunder, the vast majority of people would flinch, at least a little bit, especially if it's something you weren't prepared for. You didn't know that there was a storm coming, that kind of thing. This does not necessarily mean you're afraid of bad weather, but it is kind of human nature to flinch when there's a loud noise. It's a reflex that we have. So we're saying that there may be a stimulus that produces a response. A loud noise causes you to flinch. And what we're saying is, because we are intelligent beings capable of learning associations, if something else were to always happen when thunder happened, you would learn that association. So basically, because two things happen at the same time, we learn an association between them. So our first example here, I'll explain what Pavlov did. So he was doing research with dogs, and before conditioning, so we haven't actually taught the dogs anything yet, before conditioning, the dogs had a response to food. This was natural. An unconditioned stimulus causes an unconditioned response. The food naturally caused the dog to salivate or to drool. No one taught this to the dog. This is before conditioning. This is a natural response. And talking about salivation sounds kind of gross, but the same thing also happens with humans. When you smell good food cooking, your mouth starts to water a little bit too. You've probably had this experience. This is not something that we learn. It's something biological. It's something natural. So pay attention to the terms. Unconditioned stimulus is something that naturally causes the unconditioned response. So when Pavlov would bring in dog food, he could expect that the dogs would salivate. This was natural, normal. Also, before conditioning, he could ring a bell and the dogs would not salivate. The bell was a neutral stimulus. In other words, there was no reason for a dog to salivate to a bell. In the beginning, the bell was just a noise. The dog might have been curious, the dog might have done something, but he didn't salivate. There was no reason. The dog's not going to eat the bell, right? So before conditioning, the bell is a neutral stimulus that does not cause salivation. Okay? Now what's going to happen here is we're going to pair the bell and the food over and over again. Note that almost in every situation you have to do this pairing several times. I'll come back to where this could be potentially something that happens once in just a second. But almost always you have to pair these several times. So ring the bell, give the food. Ring the bell, give the food. Ring the bell, give the food. This is the conditioning process. What happens is that when the dog sees the food, the dog salivates. We already established that. But now the dog is learning that the bell and the food go together. He's learning an association because the bell is ringing immediately before the food is given. The dog is smart. Dog figures that out. After enough pairings, the bell, which was originally neutral, originally did not impact salivation, after enough pairings with the food, the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus capable of causing a conditioned response. Dog hears the bell, dog salivates. Why? Because the dog learned an association between the bell and the food. The bell has become conditioned. So pay attention to the terms. This is a conditioned stimulus. An unconditioned stimulus naturally causes an unconditioned response. A conditioned stimulus causes a conditioned response after conditioning. We had to teach this to the animal. Now I can walk in the room and ring the bell and the dog will salivate even if food is not present because he has been taught to do so. Let me give you some other examples here. Let's say that you are in a romantic relationship and it is fabulous. And I hope if you're in a romantic relationship, it is fabulous. You have an unconditioned stimulus of being with your partner that naturally causes an unconditioned response of being happy, assuming that your partner makes you happy. I hope you have people in your life that makes you happy, but anyway, you get the idea. Nobody had to teach you this. Being around your partner makes you feel happy. Also, smelling a perfume or cologne that you've never smelled before should not have an effect on you. You might say, oh, that smells nice, I like that. Or, ooh, I don't like that, that doesn't smell good. But it doesn't really impact your mood because you've never smelled it before. But what happens if your partner starts wearing that perfume or cologne? Now the perfume or cologne, which was originally neutral, is being paired with your partner and you smell them together, or you smell the smell, you see your partner, you smell the smell, you see your partner. Over time, you learn the association between that smell and your partner. Now that smell becomes a conditioned stimulus capable of causing a conditioned response of making you feel happy. Now, notice in both of these situations, and for the purpose of this class, because it's pretty much always like this, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are the same response. It's a question of, did I have to learn to have this response, or does this response come naturally? The dog salivating to the food was natural, unconditioned. The dog salivating to the bell was not natural, it was conditioned. You being happy, being around your partner, is unconditioned. You being happy when you smell a smell is conditioned. You had to learn that. Now, I did say there are potentially situations where this could happen much more quickly. I don't know if you've ever had food poisoning. Food poisoning is a horrific experience that I have had twice in my life. But terror of terrors, my second spell of food poisoning also happened when I was in the second trimester of my third pregnancy. Being pregnant and having food poisoning at the same time, horrific. Let me assure you that food poisoning is an unconditioned stimulus that causes an unconditioned response of a lot of unpleasant things I will not mention on YouTube. However, the food that you eat right before you get sick was originally neutral, but very quickly becomes conditioned. You never want to eat that again. Even the thought, the smell, a picture of the food that made me sick would be enough for me to not want it anymore. So why is it that only one pairing between food poisoning and whatever the food was? I don't want to ruin it for you. If you like that kind of food, I'm sure you'll have better experiences. But why is it that it only takes one pairing? Well, it makes sense biologically. My body is trying to prepare itself to, or trying to protect itself, I should say, so that I don't ever experience that again. So on occasion, it does happen quickly. Usually it takes several pairings. All right, but that's enough about my food poisoning. So, classical conditioning. First of all, we need to understand generalization. The tendency of a new stimulus, similar to the original conditioned stimulus, to produce a similar response. Basically, if we think back to Pavlov's experiment, if there's another sound that is very similar to the bell, it might also make the dog salivate. If there's a smell that is very similar to your partner's cologne, it might also make you happy. So you might generalize your classical conditioning to other conditioned stimulus because it's just very similar. Right? It's not a bit different enough for you to make a distinction. However, what happens if it's a noise that's very different from a bell? Or if it's a perfume or cologne that's very different from the one your partner uses? You probably won't respond to that. That's discrimination because you see that these two things are different and so it doesn't cause the same effect. One other thing to note here about extinction, an extinction occurs both in classical conditioning and in operant conditioning. Extinction in general is the idea that your conditioning is not permanent. It can go away. And this is why I said you need to be consistent with your conditioning. So, learning is not permanent, it can be undone. The way that you undo classical conditioning, basically, is that you present the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus over and over again. And then the conditioned response will stop happening. So, follow with me here. Let's think about Pavlov's example. Pavlov trained the dogs to learn the association between the food and the bell, so that now the bell, the conditioned stimulus, causes the conditioned response of the dog salivating. But what happens if, for weeks at a time now, you give the bell without food? Eventually the dog will say, well, the bell used to mean food, but it doesn't mean food anymore, and the dog will stop salivating to the bell. If you want the dog to continue to salivate to the bell, you have to at least occasionally give the food with the bell. Otherwise, the dog will unlearn the association. The same is true for perfume or cologne. Your partner is paired with the smell, and so because of that, the smell becomes a conditioned stimulus that causes the conditioned response. But what happens if you start seeing your partner without smelling the smell? Or what if you start smelling the smell on other people and not seeing your partner? So maybe your partner switches to a different cologne or perfume, and somebody at work starts wearing that cologne or that perfume. Initially, you will still respond to that smell because you've been trained to, but over time, if you don't have an association between that smell and your partner, you will lose that conditioned response. It won't mean anything for you anymore. So extinction is just unlearning of your conditioning. All right, let's have a classroom question here. We've been talking about dogs and perfume. How does this tie in? Patty does poorly on a math test. This makes her feel anxious. From that point on, she always becomes anxious when she's taking a math test. As the school year progresses, she begins experiencing anxiety in tests in other subjects as well. So, first of all, what's happening here? Patty's had a bad experience, and that bad experience has conditioned her. So, the unconditioned stimulus here is failure, doing poorly on a test, which I don't know if you've had that experience, but an unconditioned stimulus like failing, doing poorly, causes an unconditioned response of, in this particular situation, anxiety. Now, that's natural. That's normal. You fail at something, it makes you anxious. It makes you upset. It causes some kind of negative emotional reaction. That's unconditioned. You don't have to learn to feel bad when you fail. The problem is that she's learning an association between failure and math. So she fails a test, and it's a very extreme experience for her. This could be like my food poisoning, where it might only take once, one particular time. So then she's learned this association, so now math is a conditioned stimulus. It's been paired with the unconditioned stimulus of failure, and so now math becomes a conditioned stimulus capable of producing the conditioned response of anxiety. And so now she's developed this test anxiety specifically with math. But then you ask yourself the question, okay, she has test anxiety in math. Why is it that she starts experiencing anxiety in science or in spelling? Well, why is that? This goes back to our discussion of generalization. Perhaps a test in math is similar enough to a test in science that she generalizes that. Just like a bell ringing sounds, similar to another sound, and so the dog will respond to both. Patty's math tests are similar enough to her science tests that now she's experiencing anxiety in both. Now let's think about how we can use extinction to help her here, because this is the kind of conditioning we want to unlearn. So what we need to do is we need to expose her to a test, and maybe specifically to a math test, without failure. So give the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. In other words, we got to get Patty some success. We have to find some way to build up her confidence so that she then feels better about test taking. All right, now in this video, in this set of slides, and I'm pretty sure, I think I left these in the slides that are posted for you guys as well. I have a couple of links to videos that are amusing examples of classical conditioning. And then I have a link coming up that's an amusing example of operant conditioning. Unfortunately, when I have tried in the past to show these videos in the lecture video, YouTube flags this as, I don't know, copyright something. And so the last thing I want to do is to break the law somehow with copyrights. But you can look this up. This particular clip is from The Office. I don't know if you guys watch The Office. If not, why did you not watch The Office? I'm pretty sure it's still on Netflix, if you have Netflix. So Dwight and Jim, these two office mates that are constantly pranking each other, that's one of the reasons to watch the show. But in this particular clip, Jim decides he wants to condition Dwight, so he starts making a certain noise on his computer and giving him an Altoid at the same time, so that so that Dwight will then learn the association between the noise and the Altoid, and then at the end of the video you'll see the results of that if you look it up. You don't have to watch this, but it's pretty amusing. Also, if you guys watch Parks and Rec, I don't know if you watch Parks and Rec. I don't think it's on anymore, but once again, Netflix. There's an episode where there is a woman who is, just particularly troublesome. And there is a male character who has fallen under her spell. So to try to help him break out from under her spell, basically they spray her perfume in front of him and then slap him in the face, trying to teach him to be afraid of the smell instead of being attracted to the smell. So a couple of humorous examples there. All right. So, moving on from classical conditioning, operant conditioning is very simple. It's all about consequences. With operant conditioning, which is tied back to Skinner and Watson and other early psychologists, the idea is that when you do a behavior and it works out well for you, you are more likely to do that behavior again in the future. This is called reinforcement. Reinforcement increases the probability that a behavior will occur. You know this. If you ask somebody out and they say yes, you're more likely to be confident about asking people out, perhaps. If you study in a certain way and make a great grade, then you're more likely to study that way in the future. If you bake a certain dessert and your friends praise you for it, you'll be more likely to bake that dessert again in the future. Punishment, on the other hand, decreases the probability that a behavior will occur. So if you've ever done something and it's not worked out well for you, then you probably won't do it again. If you ask somebody out and they say no, that makes you less likely to ask somebody else out, for most people. If you bake a certain dessert and your friends think it's disgusting and tell you so, I don't know what kind of friends you guys have, then you'll be less likely to bake that again in the future. If you study a certain way for a test and then you fail that test miserably, you probably won't do that again in the future. So it's all about consequences. Now, let's add another layer to this and talk about the difference between positive and negative. So any kind of reinforcement is something that increases behavior. Any kind of punishment is something that decreases behavior, but we're also going to add in the components of positive and negative. Positive means you are adding something. Negative means you are taking something away. So let's combine these together and have some examples. Positive reinforcement, the positive part means you're adding something. The reinforcement part means you're increasing a behavior. How can you add something to increase a behavior? Well, if your child cleans his room, you might give him praise, or candy, or extra TV time. If your students work well in the classroom, you might give them grades. Grades are reinforcement. Praise, once again, or maybe some token that they can then save up and spend on something else. We're going to talk about token economies in an upcoming video. So, positive reinforcement means you are being given something that you want that then increases a behavior. You get paid when you go to your job, right? That's positive reinforcement. They're giving you money so that you will continue to come to work. If students get confused, this is usually the one where they get confused here. So let's pay attention. Negative reinforcement. The reinforcement part means we're increasing a behavior, but we're doing it in a negative way by taking something away. How could taking something away increase a behavior? Negative sounds bad, but it's not. It's reinforcement. We like reinforcement. Let me give you some examples. What if we said, if you make 100 on your test, you don't have to do your chores? I did not just give you something good. I took away something bad, assuming you don't like your chores, right? What if I said, if you do your chores, you don't have to eat your broccoli? Assuming that you don't like broccoli, then I didn't give you something good. I rewarded you by taking away something you didn't want. In this class, you get an exam drop grade. Basically what I'm saying is, you work hard on the first 4 exams, you don't have to take the final exam. That's not me giving you something. That's me taking away something you don't want. So with negative reinforcement, you take away something unpleasant that will then increase that behavior in the future. Think about this. What if you have a headache and you take Tylenol? Well, your headache goes away. And then because of that, you've been negatively reinforced. You'll be more likely to take Tylenol again in the future. Not because Tylenol gave you something good, because Tylenol took away something you didn't want, your headache, right? Okay, so then let's talk about punishment. Punishment is anything intended to decrease a behavior. Negative punishment means we're taking something away to decrease the behavior. Well, how could that work? Well, you've been fighting with your sister, so you lose your TV privileges. That's negative punishment. You have been skipping class, so you have to stay in from recess. That's negative punishment. Negative punishment means you take something away. Take away a privilege, take away a toy, you can't have dessert. You get sent to your room without dessert, that kind of thing. So you're taking away something pleasant. If you get pulled over because you've been speeding and you're given a ticket, the real thing that hurts there is not that they gave you a ticket, they're taking your money, right? We take away your money when you drive too fast, or when you park illegally, or when you don't turn in books to the library on time, or when you don't pay your electric bill on time. They take away your money, which is something intended to decrease that behavior that you have. Now, one thing to say here is that timeout, if properly done, is also negative punishment. So the basic idea behind a timeout is that a child is removed from a reinforcing setting and put into a setting where they have no reinforcement at all. Now the child doesn't get any attention, doesn't get any stimulation, so there's no TV to watch, or books to read, or toys to play with. So timeout would be an example of negative punishment. Prison would also, I'm sure that there are positive punishment aspects of prison, but the basic idea of prison is one big timeout. You lose your freedom, you lose access to your resources, that kind of thing. On the other hand, positive punishment means that you are adding something to decrease a behavior. So this could be shame, this could be guilt, this could be physical punishment. Physical punishment would fall in this category. This could be extra homework. So you misbehaved in the classroom, so they made you write, "I will behave" 100 times on the board. Extra chores that you have to do. You have to go cut the grass with scissors, or clean the bathroom floor with your toothbrush, or whatever. That's positive punishment. You are adding something unpleasant with the intention of decreasing a behavior. Now, one other thing to say is that positive and negative here should be thought of like math. Positive is adding, negative is taking away. This is not me endorsing saying that positive is a good thing and negative is a bad thing. Not that. Think about positive and negative numbers. Think about adding and subtracting. Okay, now we talked about extinction in our classical conditioning. Extinction in general means unlearning. So how do we extinguish operant conditioning? Well, previously reinforced response, then you stop reinforcing it and the response decreases. The same also goes for punishment. So let's have some examples. Let's say that I start rewarding my child for doing her math problems. And so I'm reinforcing for math problems, and then I stop giving that reinforcement. Well, she might stop doing her math problems because it was previously reinforced, and that's why the behavior was happening. But when you stop reinforcing it, it stops. The same is also true for punishment. If you have a child that is yelling, and so you punish the child for yelling, the child is probably going to stop yelling. But then, if you stop punishing, the behavior will come back. Remember what I said earlier about consistency. We need to do this consistently and also immediately. So one other thing to say here is that the whole just wait till your father gets home is the wrong way to reinforce and punish children. If you wait hours or even minutes, really, between the behavior and the consequence, the child doesn't understand which behavior it was that led to that consequence. So the last thing you want to do is say, well, you're going to get punished in 3 hours, so you just be prepared for that. No, you need to do the punishment or the reinforcement immediately and consistently. All right, so let's have some examples. Nick frequently gets out of his seat and entertains his classmates with humorous remarks. His teacher, Mr. Lincoln, often scolds Nick for his behavior. However, Nick's classmates laugh when Nick makes his remarks and the scolding isn't working. So Nick just continues with his antics. So first of all, what is Mr. Lincoln attempting to do when he scolds Nick? Well, scolding someone would be an example of positive punishment. You are adding something that is intended to decrease the behavior. So this could be shaming, make you feel guilty. This could be nagging, any number of things. You're getting on to someone, whatever your terminology. Okay, but it's not working. Why is it that Nick is being punished, but the punishment's not decreasing his behaviors? Well, one thing to say is that not all reinforcements work for all individuals, and not all punishments work for all individuals. So you have to find what works for them. So you start here perhaps. You start with a reprimand, but the reprimand's not working. And part of that may be because Nick is not concerned about your reprimand, but it could be that Nick is concerned about your reprimand. It's just that the attention from his classmates is so reinforcing that it's stronger than your punishment. Okay, so what are some strategies? There are several different things we can do. You might just try a different punishment. It seems like Nick likes attention, which he's getting from his classmates. So separating him from his classmates would then separate him from the attention. I don't know if you have some kind of timeout situation in the classroom, or maybe removing him from the classroom, so sending him to detention, send him to the principal's office, that kind of thing. Or you could also try punishing the classmates. If the attention is what's maintaining the bad behavior, then let's punish the classmates, and then the attention won't be there anymore. You could try that. You could also try getting Nick attention for positive behaviors instead of for negative behaviors. This is something we're going to talk about in the next lecture video. But Nick needs attention. All kids need attention. So maybe there's something we can do in the classroom to give him attention for positive behaviors, not for negative behaviors. Just a few ideas. So as I said, there are some clips in here that I would really like to play for you guys, but YouTube shuts down my video when I do that. But if you're interested, you can click through with these links. This is a clip from The Big Bang Theory, which I had a clip earlier in the semester from The Big Bang Theory. Basically what happens here is that Sheldon has some things he doesn't like about Penny, and so he starts using chocolates as reinforcement for positive behavior, and then he also incorporates some punishment in there as well, which is kind of humorous. You don't have to watch these videos, but may be helpful if you do. I think just living with Sheldon would be punishment enough. Alright, let's have some examples. A child studies hard for a test, so his parents allow him to skip his chores for that day. This makes it more likely that the child will study hard for his next test. Alright, let's see what happened. First of all, did we reinforce or punish? Well, this is reinforcement because we are making a behavior more likely. So once we know that it's reinforcement, then we ask ourselves, is this positive or negative? Did his parents give him something good, or did they take away something bad? They took away his chores. So this is an example of negative reinforcement. We took away the chores for studying hard, so the child will be more likely to study in the future. A child misbehaves, so his parents take his favorite toy away. This makes it less likely that the child will misbehave again. Is this reinforcement or punishment? This is punishment because we are making it less likely. We are decreasing the likelihood. Now, once we've established that this is punishment, is this positive or negative? Did the parents add something bad, or did they take away something good? Well, they took away something he wanted. So this is negative punishment. All right. An instructor gives students extra credit points for attending class the day after exams. As a result, students are more likely to attend class on those days. So, first question, is this reinforcement or punishment? And obviously this is reinforcement. We are making it more likely that students attend class. Is this positive reinforcement, adding something good? Or is this negative reinforcement, taking away something bad? Well, the students were given extra credit, so we're adding something good. So this is positive reinforcement. And then a parent spanks her child for breaking a vase. This makes the child less likely to break things. So is this reinforcement or punishment? Well, this is punishment because we're making it less likely. Is this positive, adding, or yes, positive, so with punishment we're adding something negative, Or is this negative, so we're taking away something the child wants? Well, this is positive punishment because we are adding something, in this case pain, to try to decrease the behavior. Once again, I want to reiterate that what I'm saying is that we're positive is adding and negative is taking away. Not that I'm saying that positive is good. This is not me endorsing corporal punishment, but this is an example of positive punishment because we are adding something to decrease a behavior. All right, so that is a crash course in behavior modification. So here is your activity, give you a chance to practice with it. Imagine that you are a 4th grade teacher. One of your students has a very difficult time staying in his seat. How could you address this issue with positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment? So what I'm wanting you to do is give me an example of each of these. So positive reinforcement, add something good to make a behavior more likely. Negative reinforcement, take away something bad to make a behavior more likely. Positive punishment, add something bad to decrease the likelihood of the behavior. Negative punishment, take away something good to decrease the likelihood of the behavior. Sometimes I do this activity and students get confused and only give me one example and spend the entire activity talking about positive reinforcement. I'm wanting an example of each of these. If you have questions about this, let me know, but I want you to be thinking about several different ways that you could attack this problem. So you would want to increase the staying in the seat behavior. You would want to decrease the getting out of the seat behavior with punishment. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions about that. Also, one other announcement that will be coming up will be relevant with the next lecture videos. You do get 2 drop grades for activities. So if you've gotten full credit on activities 1 through 10, which you're about to do 10, if you get full credit on 1 through 10, then you can essentially skip 11 and 12 because you get 2 drop grades. But if you missed an activity or if you did not get full credit for an activity, then activities 11 and 12 will be there to give you a chance to earn some of those points back. And let me know if you have any questions about any of that or about anything from lecture today. Otherwise, during our next lecture video, we're going to be carrying on with more information about how to use behavior modification. So I will talk to you guys then.